Hi, I'm Jasmine Wigfall. I'm the Legislative Director here at Social Security Works, and welcome to our August SOAR office hours. This month, we're going to answer some of your questions related to strategy and how we anticipate Social Security expansion legislation moving forward in the rest of 2021 and 2022. I want to hop right in to make sure that we can answer as many questions as possible through the session here today. So first up is, why didn't Congress pass Social Security legislation in 2021? I would say there are two main reasons why Congress didn't pass Social Security legislation in 2021. The first is that in the world today, we all are very familiar that there's a pandemic going on. Congress had to do something to provide relief for the millions of Americans who are struggling because they have either become unemployed, they have a lack of childcare because they have almost lost their homes because their business is struggling, all of those different things. Congress had to provide federal relief for that. And so for the first part of the year, Congress spent a significant portion of time making sure that we experienced relief related to the pandemic. As I've said before and will continue to say, Congress moves not at lightning speed. So these packages take time to put together. And so again, that's how they spent the first part of the year. Next up, they wanted to pass legislation that they could pass with a simple majority. That means that they could overcome a filibuster in the Senate, or they could use budget reconciliation to pass a piece of significant legislation. And so that's exactly what they're doing right now in building this huge infrastructure package. It was a major priority for President Biden to ensure that we invested in our roads and in our bridges. And our highways, but additionally, he wanted to make sure we invested in different forms of human infrastructure. So think of paid family leave, our Medicare system, all sorts of home and community-based services, things that people need on a regular basis that really builds up our communities and our families. So there are two different pieces of legislation moving right now. One will pass likely through regular order. The other will pass through a process called budget reconciliation, which I will not spend time today going through. But the point is that both of those packages will take some time to get through. As a matter of fact, I predict that they will take the remainder of 2021 for Congress to really pass them through both chambers, reconcile the differences, come together to pass the same bills, and then get those to the president's desk. I should tell you that there are some really good things in the particular package that will likely get passed through budget reconciliation. That package includes potentially Medicare being able to include hearing, dental, and vision coverage, negotiating prescription drug prices, making sure that out-of-pocket caps are included for beneficiaries. Also, the potential for the eligibility age for Medicare to get lowered to include more older adults. And we are fighting for all of those things, in addition to many, many other things like investing, like I said, in home and community-based services for seniors, for people with disabilities. Those things are extremely important. But again, because they can be done through a simple majority in the Senate, that's why they're being prioritized now over Social Security. But as we will cover in the next few minutes, I think, we anticipate that there's a possibility Congress can move in 2022 to pass Social Security legislation. So relatedly, the next question says, is there a chance more of the expansion bills we saw last year, is there a possibility they get introduced or reintroduced in this Congress? The short of that is yes. I absolutely believe that there is a chance we will see more expansion bills brought up in the 117th Congress. As I said, Congress has been preoccupied dealing with COVID-19, dealing with this infrastructure package. And so they haven't really been expeditious in making sure that we're seeing our Social Security expansion bills that we're used to seeing. But we continue to be in contact with the offices that are really champions on this topic. I know Chairman Larson is in the process of working on some things, and we're hoping to see a bill from him really soon. I know that Representative Sanchez has recently introduced an expansion bill in the House. I believe there are champions in the Senate doing similar work. And so absolutely, I believe that there will be more expansion bills. But we know that, again, Congress has been prioritizing some other things first. But rest assured, they have told us that they are planning on working on Social Security after these sorts of priorities have started to settle down some. Let's move on to our next question. How do we ensure Congress focuses more on Social Security expansion legislation in 2022? So that's kind of a follow-up to the last question, but what we anticipate, again, in 2022 is that some members of Congress will want to focus a lot more on Social Security naturally, but in order for us to see real progress through Congress, we absolutely need advocates to be involved across the country. And so things that you can do to ensure that there's more focus is really to make sure that you are communicating with your member of Congress, but in addition, taking it to the next level. So you don't just want to contact your member of Congress and make sure that they are co-sponsors of these pieces of legislation that you support and that you want to see passed. But you also want to be in contact with congressional leadership. The relevant ones that I can think of off the top of my head are obviously Speaker Nancy Pelosi. You want to make sure that she understands that the country really needs expansion legislation related to Social Security, and you want to see it brought to the House floor. The same thing goes for Leader Schumer in the Senate. While, his personal office is very supportive of Social Security, you want to make sure that he understands that you want this to be a priority for the entire Senate and that you want to see these sorts of bills come to the floor, at least for a vote. Even if there's no chance of them passing, you still want to see where members of Congress lie, because there's a lot of knowledge in that and understanding where people stand in their position. You might think maybe that person doesn't need to represent me if they don't support particular legislation. So those are the sorts of leaders I'm thinking of. In addition to Speaker Pelosi and Leader Schumer, I would say the chairs of the committees of jurisdiction are also extremely important. So in the House, that's going to be Chairman Richie Neal. He is the chair of the Ways and Means Committee. And then in the Senate, it's Chairman Ron Wyden. He is the chair of the Senate Finance Committee. Those are the two committees, as we've talked about before, that have jurisdiction over Social Security. And if you have the same sort of communication with their offices, telling them that I'm a Social Security beneficiary, or I will be a Social Security beneficiary, and I want to see this program strengthened and expanded, and I would love to see you give these bills some sort of consideration in your committee. Those sorts of things empower them to be able to make the sort of changes we're thinking about. So I encourage you all, because you all are super advocates, to really just take your advocacy up a notch, not just contacting your member of the House and your senators, but to contact leadership and let them know what you want to see make it to the House and to the Senate floor. Lastly, the other thing you can do is actually put pressure on the White House. So obviously our executive branch and our legislative branch operate separately, and they do not technically have any sort of relationship that requires that they operate together. But the Democrats control the House, the Senate, and the White House. And so they obviously have an agenda that is aligned. And so if we're also pressuring President Biden to say, hey, you should make this part of your agenda, Congress will listen if you say that this is a priority for you in 2022. That's another option that we can work through as well. So let's move on to the next question. Just a couple more. We have time for a couple more. What does victory for Social Security expansion in 2022 look like? That is an excellent question because victory in each Congress, I think, looks a little bit different depending on who's in leadership, who are the main players in each committee. Victory could look different depending on which party is in charge, obviously. So in 2022, one thing we have to consider is that it's an election year. So that means Congress is going to do the bulk of its work way before we ever get to November of 2022. Another thing to consider is that the Democrats right now have very slim majorities in the House and the Senate. So that means if they're passing something that makes it to the president's desk through the Senate, if the Senate never gets rid of the filibuster, then whatever they pass through has to have bipartisan support. So that adds another challenge on top of that. But victory doesn't necessarily look like passing something that's just bipartisan through the House and the Senate and making sure the president sign it. I think that's one form of victory, but there are several others that I can think of. So one is that each committee of jurisdiction is holding really good hearings, making sure that they are bringing to light stories that highlight Social Security expansion, making sure that we're bringing in experts that are telling the right perspective of what Social Security does for this country, the investments that it makes into different businesses, all of the things that it does for people's everyday lives to make sure that they have healthcare, to make sure they have housing and food. All of those things are important to get highlighted. And having hearings is an important part of the congressional process. So that's just another form of victory. I would say something else would be the House can pass things with a simple majority, regardless of what the Senate can do. So I think having a comprehensive piece of Social Security legislation actually pass through the House would be an extremely important step in this process to having Social Security expansion legislation eventually pass through the Senate as well and to the president's desk. So that for me is another form of victory. I can think of a couple of others. Maybe another thing would be having more co-sponsors and more champions, because we can't just have one person who is one member of Congress who is extremely passionate about this topic. There are hundreds of members of Congress, and there should be many, many champions for Social Security. And we've seen over the last few months, we have some new champions talking about supplemental security income, which is, as we've talked about, an important part of our Social Security system. I believe we need even more champions in the House and the Senate talking about this program, making sure that they are being vocal to leadership, being vocal in their communities, really making it clear that Social Security is important, it can never be cut, and as a matter of fact, it should be strengthened and expanded. And then lastly, I think that I said earlier that passing bipartisan legislation wasn't the only way, but that is, I mean, that could be a form of victory, because there are some things that I believe Democrats and Republicans in Congress actually could support together. There's some policies that I've seen in the past that have been quite bipartisan. One, for example, being the getting rid of any sort of WEP GPO, right? If we repeal the WEP GPO, I've seen Republicans and Democrats co-sponsor that legislation, and that's something that I think we could pass potentially in Congress in 2022 if Congress is looking and if they are pushed to pass Social Security expansion legislation. But the important thing to remember, of course, is that all of the policies that we're talking about, as we've shown you in our polling, they are extremely bipartisan in the United States. So the American people are all on board with doing more, with making sure that benefits are strong, making sure they are expanded, making sure that there are better benefits for students, for widows and widowers, for all of us together. I think that we can do more than maybe what some members of Congress think that they can do in 2022. So again, it'll be up to us to make sure that our voices are heard and make sure that we are looking for victories of all types in 2022. I think on the flip side of that, there was a question about what does losing look like? So Social Security Works will never support a piece of legislation that will cut benefits for anyone. So that to me is probably one of the biggest markers of what losing looks like in 2022. If we pass a piece of Social Security legislation that does a bunch of good things for maybe a small group of people, and then it cuts benefits for another group of people, that is a compromise that we would be unwilling to make. And we hope that you all are fighting for the same thing. The point of our movement is not to cut benefits or to make unnecessary compromises. It is to strengthen and expand the program for everyone. And so I think that's one of the main things that would look like losing in 2022. The other thing would be if there was any form of a commission that was started. So Social Security is often brought up by who I would say who are opponents to the program. They want to reform Social Security in some sort of bipartisan commission that fast tracks legislation, and they do it behind closed doors. That is completely unacceptable and not something that we would ever support in 2022. We've already heard rumblings of it from Senator Lindsey Graham and a few others, and that cannot happen. Anybody who wants to do any sort of Social Security reforms behind closed doors likely wants to cut the program because Congress is set up in a bipartisan manner naturally. We already have committees, we already have everyone allowed to voice their opinions, and it's public. We can see what happens, and it has to be done in decency and order when it's done in front of everyone. And so what we don't want is to move that process behind closed doors and experience some sort of compromise where people are saying they're okay with cuts. So I think that's one more form of what losing looks like. So to wrap up, we have one more question. What will good Social Security expansion legislation look like? It could look like a lot of different things. There's so many policies that we support related to Social Security expansion, but I just want to go through a couple in the last few minutes of this session. Good legislation will often include an across-the-board increase for everyone. That means that everyone's benefits go up. Good legislation will likely change how we calculate the cost of living adjustment. It will make the cost of living adjustment more accurate to what seniors and to what people with disabilities are experiencing in their everyday lives. Good legislation will include some targeted increases. So that means making sure that we're increasing benefits for widows and widowers, making sure we're increasing student benefits, including benefits for grand families, making sure that we're giving a bump to people who live long, a birthday bump for people who live long into the years. We want to make sure that they are experiencing the best benefit that they can. So increasing their benefits, increasing the minimum benefit. So for the lowest income beneficiaries, ensuring their benefit is strengthened. There could also be inclusion of of provisions to make sure that the Social Security Administration is strong, making sure that they are sending out annual statements, making sure that our field offices remain open. There are just so many different provisions. And as we start to send you all new legislation, you all will see a lot of those ideas highlighted by different members of Congress. Everyone has different priorities, and you'll see some of those in a comprehensive form, and you'll see some of them written out individually. But either way, good legislation can look like a lot of different things. But we will continue to highlight those things to you and make sure that you are aware of what good legislation looks like when we highlight it to you. Similarly, we often show what bad legislation looks like in some of our Social Security Works emails. So I want to wrap it up here. It's been about 20 minutes. So I appreciate you all for joining us again for another session of our office hours. I hope that this was useful for you. I hope that if you have any other questions about strategy and what we anticipate in 2022, that you just reach out to us, because we're happy to have a part 2 of this strategy session, especially as we see what bills come out in the next few months and what bills are introduced into the next year. But just to wrap it up for today, as always, we encourage you all to visit our website, socialsecurityworks.org. If you ever have any questions or want more resources on our Social Security expansion priorities, to get started on SOAR, if you haven't started the course yet, you can visit socialsecurityworks.org/SOAR. All of the information to register is there, and the course is completely on demand, so that means you can take it at your own pace. If you have any of those questions that I mentioned earlier, or if you just have questions in general about SOAR or anything else, you can always email us at soar@socialsecurityworks.org. And then lastly, we want to invite you to tweet with us and to post with us on Facebook. On Twitter, we're at twitter.com/ssworks. And on Facebook, you can go to facebook.com/socialsecurityworks. So again, thank you for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you all next month in September, where I'm hopeful that we'll have a chance to talk more about some specific Social Security expansion legislation. Take care and stay safe.